Good morning. 2 Kings 13, 1-13. We learn about two kings from the northern kingdom of Israel, Jehoahaz and Joash, both from the house of Jehu. Jehu was the king chosen by God by bringing judgment on Ahab's family. Because Jehu destroyed a Baal worship, God promised his descendants would rule for 4 generations. However, like the kings before them, Jehoahaz and Joash failed to remove the golden calves that King Jeroboam set up in Dan and Bethel to stop people from worshiping in Jerusalem. These idols were treated as if they represent God, but in Exodus 20, God clearly commanded not to make any image of him. This idol worship was a sin, and none of Israel's king could overcome, and it eventually led to God's judgment on them. At first glance, this passage might seem like just a story about kings, but it reveals something deeper. Even though Israel was lost in sin, God still sustained the nation and showed them His grace. That's how God operates. But if we ignore His grace, judgment eventually follows. Our lives are the same. No matter what we are going through, God's grace is always there. But if we don't notice it, we cannot find the true healing. Even when we fail, God's grace is there, calling us back to Him. The big question is, are we aware of God's grace? And are we responding to it? Are you seeing God's grace in your life today? If not, now is the time to reflect. Without recognizing His grace, real restoration cannot happen. Let's be a people who not only see God's grace, but also respond to it with all our hearts. Today's passage we can divide into 2 kings. First is Jehoahaz, the 11th king of Israel. The second is Joash, the 12th king. Both were descendants of the Jehu dynasty. Starting with the Jehoahaz, verse 1 tells us that during the 23rd year of the king Joash of the Judah's reign, Jehoahaz became a king of Israel, which is the north, and ruled for 17 years. Verse 2 says that Jehoahaz didn't remove the golden calf altars that Jeroboam had set up and continued to in the sin Jeroboam. Because of this, verse 3 tells us that God handed Israel over to the Aramean kings Hazael and his son Ben-hadad. But in verse 4, Jehoahaz shocked God in his suffering. And in verse 5, God sent a deliverer to save them. The Bible doesn't specify who is the deliverer was, but what matters is that God saved them. This idea of the deliverer connects with the judges. In the book of Judges, where God is also sent the judges to rescue His people. Through all of this, we see God's grace. Even though Israel sinned, God saw their suffering and saved them. Yet, verse 6 shows that Israel still didn't turn away from Jeroboam's sin of idol worship and even kept the Asherah pole in place. Because of this, verse 7 says God judged them, reducing their army to almost nothing. But the fact that a small army remained was still an act of God's grace. Verse 8 and 9 summarize the rest of the Jehoahaz's reign with the typical closing statement. Aren't the rest of his deeds written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Israel? Even here, we see God's grace. Whether the king were good or bad, God was still with them, remaining their God. Next verses 10-13 describe the Joash's reign. In the 37th year of the king Joash of the Judah, which is the south, Jehoahaz's son Joash became a king of Israel. He reigned for 16 years. Verse 11 tells us that Joash followed Jeroboam's sin and did evil. Verse 12 and 13 end with the standard closing remarks, noting Joash's death and succession of his son Jeroboam II. In today's passage, both Jehoahaz and Joash of Israel didn't break away from the Jeroboam's idol worship. Yet, despite their sins, God still showed them grace and protected them. Because Jehu wiped out Baal worship, God promised his descendants would rule for 4 generations. When Jehoahaz turned to God during the Aram's oppression, God sent a deliverer to save them. All of this was God's grace. But the Israelites kept turning back to idols when things got better, not recognizing God's grace. Similarly, God loved us even while we were still sinners and sent Jesus to save us. Romans 5:8 says, "But God demonstrates His own love for us in this, while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. This salvation is also God's grace. So how can we recognize God's grace in our lives? First, we need to intentionally look for His grace and be thankful for it. Second, even in tough times, we need to trust that God will provide a way out. Finally, we need to respond to God's grace by following and obeying Him. Today, I hope you will see God's grace in your life, be thankful for it, and respond to it with your actions.